I'd also like to talk about how we can prioritize well-being in the average day, though. This begins sometimes by recognizing that to step forward, we actually need to take a step back first. But proactive recovery, I'd argue, actually doesn't start in the day. It begins the night before. It begins with adequate quality sleep. Now, for most people, this means a minimum of 7 hours of sleep, I'm afraid to say. I know some of us might struggle to achieve that, but the evidence is pretty overwhelming that 7 hours represents the threshold. Some people need a bit more than that. But I'd encourage you, if you're not sleeping for 7 hours per night, at least 7 hours, try to just nudge your average sleep towards that. You might be surprised at the benefits that you experience. And even in the highest performing organizations that I've worked with, I consistently see, and there's various other forms of evidence that support this, that there's a direct link between not sleeping enough and lower cognitive performance. Consistently, the shortest nights of sleep precede the lowest cognitive performance. And these data are taken from some of the world's top performing organizations that I've worked with. We also see decreases in performance related to some of the capabilities that are likely to be key sources of competitive advantage for organizations like JLR. For example, when we don't sleep enough, we sleep fewer than 7 hours, problem-solving ability decreases by over 60%. There's also an effect on our teams. It's not just about our own performance and well-being. There was some interesting data gathered from wearable devices combined with some other data sources that demonstrated that when leaders are carrying a high level of sleep debt, this means when leaders haven't slept enough, their teams report lower psychological safety. This is very likely because when we don't sleep enough, our emotional processing is impaired. Now, some people have looked into this in depth, and they would argue that sleep is so critical for emotional processing that we should characterize it as nighttime therapy. So it's not just your sleep for your well-being, it also has a direct impact on your teams too. But in terms of performance, if you were to look at the data overall, it seems that if you were to sleep for 6 hours per night for 2 weeks, you would experience declines in cognitive performance equivalent to dropping 15 IQ points. That's about the same as going an entire night without sleep. The problem is that for many of us, this decrease in cognitive performance has just kind of become a new normal. We don't really notice the effects. And what I see in high-performing organizations like JLR is people still get the job done, they still hit those targets, but they often have to work a lot harder to achieve them than they otherwise would if they'd been able to sleep more adequately to get closer to that 7-hour threshold, or perhaps even a bit more if they need to. Now, I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about sleep. I could go on and do an entire session about it, but I did want to share these 10 top tips for improving your sleep. Please feel free to take a picture of the slides, and they might be helpful, and feel free to share them with people as well. Now, the first tip is about temperature. Now, very often, our bedroom environment is warmer than it should be for optimal sleep. Ideally, it should feel a little bit cool when we get into bed. And in practice, this means having a room temperature around 18 degrees centigrade. Related to that, we want to choose bedding and clothing that's going to minimize the chances of overheating. One of the most helpful things that we can do for ensuring that we get adequate quality sleep is to have a regular sleep and wake time. Now, I'd argue that adults need bedtimes too. There was a recent large body of work reviewed by a group of sleep experts as part of kind of a consensus-making statement, and their consensus statement was that sleep regularity, the consistency of our sleep and wake times, could be almost as important as sleep duration. Now, I recognize this isn't always possible, but if you can, could you make your sleep and wake times a bit more regular than they are at the moment? How many people here enjoy caffeine? Me. We all love it, don't we? About 80% of the world consume caffeine in one form or another. Unfortunately, caffeine has quite a long half-life. So for the average person, it takes about 6 hours for caffeine to reach 50% of its concentration post-consumption and absorption in your bloodstream. Now, that half-life varies. It's genetically determined for the most part. It can vary between as short as 1 hour up to 9 hours. But in practice, this means that for most people, you can have a few coffees in the morning. If you don't stop early enough, there can still be enough caffeine hanging around at the end of the day to interfere with your sleep. So I encourage you to do an experiment again. Stop caffeine after midday for a week and see what effect you notice on your sleep. And many people find that stopping caffeine after midday has a really positive effect on their sleep, and they hadn't realized previously how harmful it was in terms of increasing the time it took to get to sleep, maybe disrupting their sleep as well. So humour me, give it a go. Hopefully you'll be surprised by the benefits. You might have heard people talk about how dangerous devices are. Don't look at your smartphone when you're in bed, for example, and don't look at it in the evening. And they've kind of got a point. You might have heard some podcasters say, the blue light from the screens is interfering with melatonin production. It's going to destroy your sleep. Well, it turns out that the relationship isn't quite as simple as that. It turns out that the light from your screen is only really harmful if you've been in a very dull environment during the day. It seems that there's a strong contrast effect. So if you've had enough bright light during the day, the blue light from these screens doesn't seem to interfere so much. Even then, it seems that the biggest factor is actually potentially the time we spend on the devices displacing time for sleep. So we're kind of procrastinating, we should just go to bed. And also, if we're looking at content that stresses us out, like you're reading and replying to emails, that could interfere with sleep. If you're just using your phone to kind of watch something on Netflix that's relaxing, that's fun, the evidence would indicate it's maybe not a massive problem, providing you're not displacing time for sleep. There's a phenomenon you might have heard of, revenge bedtime procrastination. Anyone heard of that before? It describes this tendency that we sometimes have. If we've had a very long work day, for example, and we get home at the end of the day, and we feel like we want some time back for ourselves. So we take revenge by procrastinating and maybe watching an extra episode or something instead of going to bed. So beware revenge bedtime procrastination. There was an interesting interview with the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, a few years ago, and he argued in this interview that he believes your sleep is his biggest competition. And he's probably got a point. I think I can relate to that. I've got a top tip for you to maybe reduce revenge bedtime procrastination. What happens when you get to the end of your favourite series, an episode on Netflix? Queues up the next one automatically. Even gives you the opportunity to skip the introduction. If you're anything like me and my wife, we tell ourselves the same thing every time. It always ends on a cliffhanger, right? And I'm like, I just want to see what's next. Let's just watch the first 5 minutes just to see if the person's died or not, or whatever it is. Well, we never do. We always watch another episode, and then a bit of the next one, and we've lost another 45 to 50 minutes of sleep. Did you know you can turn off autoplay on Netflix and other streaming platforms? All you need to do is you need to log into the web interface often. You go to settings, and you can manually switch off autoplay. And many people find, myself included, that little bit of friction that's created in that user experience, having to go and manually click on and open up the next episode, can provide just enough time for our rational brain to get in control and help us to make the good decision to go to bed rather than watching whatever episode is next.